David Cam was born and raised in Indiana to a small but close-knit family where the values of respect, hard work, and a desire to help others were instilled in him from an early age. His childhood was spent in a quiet suburb full of green streets where children played without fear for their safety. David's parents paid much attention to his upbringing, trying to develop in their son a sense of responsibility and kindness. He was an active child who enjoyed participating in school activities and often played basketball with friends, demonstrating leadership qualities and athletic talent. After graduating from high school, David decided to follow a path that he felt would allow him to make the world a better place. He joined the Indiana State Police. His choice did not come as a surprise to those around him. David always said he wanted to help people and protect those in need. His parents were proud of their son, and his friends supported his decision, knowing that he would be dedicated to his job. In the service, David quickly established himself as a responsible and reliable officer. He was known for his professionalism and commitment to maintaining order. Colleagues appreciated him for his calmness in difficult situations and readiness to always come to the rescue. Police service brought him not only a sense of accomplishment but also confidence that he had chosen the right path. In the early 1990s, David's life changed when he met Kimberly Renner. Their introduction occurred at a local event where many people from their neighborhood gathered. Kimberly immediately caught David's attention with her energy, smile, and sincerity. She was an open and friendly person who was able to find common ground with any interlocutor. David, despite his confidence, was struck by her charm and decided to get to know her. From the first conversation between them, there was a feeling that they had known each other all their lives. They had a lot in common: love of sports, family values, and dreams of a future filled with joy and harmony. They began dating and their relationship grew rapidly. Kimberly supported David in all his endeavors, and he, in turn, admired her ability to fill life with light and warmth. Soon they decided to get married. Their wedding was a momentous occasion for both families and friends who saw how happy the newlyweds were. David and Kimberly built their relationship on mutual understanding and support, dreaming of creating a family that would be an example to others. They moved to Georgetown, Indiana, where they began building their life in a cozy home. In 1994, their happiness became even more complete. Their son Braydon was born. It was a special moment for David. He was proud of his role as a father and strived to be the best example for his child. Kimberly, who always dreamed of a large family, fully devoted herself to taking care of the baby. Braydon grew up an active and inquisitive child who pleased his parents with his first words, steps, and smiles. 2 years later, in 1996, their family was enriched with another child, a daughter, Jill. The girl immediately became the favorite of the whole family. She brought more light and joy into the house, and now David and Kimberly were happier than ever. Jill was sociable and cheerful, and her older brother Braydon became her protector and best friend. Together, the children spent a lot of time playing in the garden or participating in family trips. By 2000, the Cam family was living in a cozy home that had become a real fortress for them. David, after leaving the police force, decided to devote more time to his wife and children and to start his own business. This transition was not easy, but Kimberly supported her husband, believing in his abilities and desire to take care of the future of the family. David, in turn, strived to do everything he could to make his wife and children feel happy and secure. Their family life was filled with harmony and joy. They often spent weekends together traveling around the neighborhood or playing sports. Braydon and Jill loved playing basketball with their father or listening to the stories he told about his police work. Kimberly made the house cozy and always took time to give attention to each member of the family. Neighbors and friends admired this family and considered it a role model. David and Kimberly kept in touch with the community by participating in charitable events and helping other families. Their lives seemed perfect, and no one could have imagined that something terrible could happen in this idyll. September 28, 2000 was an ordinary fall day in Georgetown, Indiana. The local community was living a familiar life. Children played in the streets, neighbors chatted with each other about everyday activities, and family homes gradually fell into evening silence. The Camm family home was also quiet. No one could have guessed that this day would be the beginning of one of the worst stories to rock this small town. Toward evening, the local emergency services received a disturbing call. A man's voice, full of terror and panic, reported that 3 people, a woman and 2 children, had been found dead in the garage of a house. The emergency operator immediately dispatched the nearest patrol cars and paramedics to the scene. The call sounded too serious to be left without an immediate response. By the time the first police patrols arrived, the street in front of the house was dark and silent. A dim light was on in the garage, which only emphasized the tension of the situation. The officers approached the house cautiously, not knowing what to expect. When they entered the garage, they were greeted by what they would later describe as one of the creepiest scenes they had ever witnessed. In the driver's seat of the Ford Bronco automobile was the body of a woman. She was sitting as if she had just parked the car, but her head was oddly slumped over the steering wheel. Her face and head showed signs of a gunshot wound. Apparently, she died instantly before she even realized what had happened. Her body was motionless, but the position of her arms and legs indicated that the attack had been sudden. A little farther away, on the floor of the garage, lay the bodies of two children. A boy and a girl, dressed in ordinary household clothes, were motionless. Both had gunshot wounds. They were lying close to each other, and this proximity heightened the tragedy of what was happening. The police immediately called medical examiners to document the deaths and begin examining the scene. The medics who arrived at the scene only confirmed the terrible thing: the woman and the children were dead. Their deaths, judging by the condition of their bodies, had occurred recently, probably within the last few hours. The first questions that arose were, who could have done such a thing and why? All three had been shot at close range, indicating that the killer was either in close proximity to the victims or had used a weapon with a precise aim. Police officers began to scrutinize the garage. The first detail that caught their attention was the lack of visible signs of a struggle. It looked as if the victims were not expecting an attack. The garage doors and the entrance to the house had no damage, indicating that there was no forced entry. This could mean that the perpetrator was either familiar with the family or was able to enter the house unhindered. Another oddity was the lack of burglary. There was no indication that anything was missing from the house. There was a car in the garage, the victim's personal belongings were in place, and nothing of value had been touched. This led police to speculate that the motive for the murder was not money or material possessions. Blood stains on the floor and clothing of the victims also came to the attention of investigators. Experts noticed that the blood spatters were directed in different directions, indicating different angles of the gunshots. This required careful analysis to determine the sequence of events. The woman, the medics concluded, was shot first, judging from her position and the condition of her body. This could mean that the killer started with her and then switched to the children, who were probably nearby. Police officers began interviewing neighbors to see if anyone had heard gunshots or noticed any suspicious faces in the area. However, none of the residents could recall anything out of the ordinary. The quiet evening was not disturbed by noise or shouting. This only added to the mystery of the case. At the same time, the search for additional clues began in the house. The detectives checked all the rooms, trying to find anything that might shed light on what had happened. However, nothing suspicious was found here either. The house looked like the family was just living their normal lives until sudden tragedy struck them. Officers noted that the crime scene looked too clean for such a brutal attack. This suggested that the killer may have planned his actions in advance and carefully considered how to avoid detection. The lack of fingerprints, signs of a struggle, and evidence only made the task of investigation more difficult. Immediately after examining the crime scene, the police began developing leads. One of the first thoughts was that it could have been related to internal conflicts or personal revenge. However, the Camm family was known as a friendly and prosperous family. Neighbors described them as the perfect family who were always open and friendly. There was no indication that anyone might harbor a grudge or conflict with them. By the next morning, the street where the Camm family lived was surrounded by police cars and reporters. News of the brutal murder of a woman and two children spread through the neighborhood, causing shock and bewilderment among the locals. People wondered how this could have happened in their peaceful and safe neighborhood. After Kimberly and the children's bodies were recovered, police decided to interview David Cam, the husband and father of the victims. As the man who found the victims and was the first to call emergency services, he was an important witness. However, investigators could not rule out the possibility of his involvement in the tragedy. In such cases, the law requires that anyone who is near the victims be questioned to clarify details and verify alibis. The interrogation began on the night of the tragedy. David, in a state of shock, told the investigators his version of events. He described going to a basketball game with friends after work, as he did regularly. The evening began as usual. He met with his comrades, changed into a sports uniform, and spent about 2 hours on the court. The game ended around 9 p.m., after which he went home. When he drove up to the house, he was immediately alerted by the ajar garage door and the darkness in the windows. Once inside, he saw the bodies of his wife and children. According to him, the first thing he did was try to save them, but after realizing they were dead, he called the police. David claimed he acted on instinct, not realizing what was happening. His words sounded sincere, but the details raised questions for investigators. They asked him to elaborate on how his evening went, what time he left the basketball court, and who he socialized with. David provided a list of people who could corroborate his alibi and readily answered all questions despite his apparent shock. Despite David's emotional state, the investigators could not rule him out as a suspect. The situation at the crime scene looked strange. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a robbery, and evidence such as blood on his clothes that required careful analysis. In addition, statistics on such crimes show that in most cases, homicides in families are committed by someone close to the family. One officer later admitted that David's tone during the interview seemed unusually calm for a man who had just lost his entire family. Although his story was consistent, investigators could not ignore the subtlety with which he described every detail. This raised suspicions that he may have prepared his version of events in advance. When the investigators started asking tougher questions, David firmly denied his involvement in the tragedy. He stated that he had never harmed his family and could not even imagine someone capable of such a thing. "I loved my wife and children more than life. I would have given anything to save them," he said. His eyes filled with tears as he spoke of his last moments spent next to their bodies. David repeatedly emphasized that he was at the basketball game and could provide witnesses who would confirm his alibi. He assured police that he had no motive or desire to harm his family, and insisted that he was as much a victim as Kimberly and the children. Despite David's emotionality, investigators remained skeptical. Several key points demanded explanation. The blood on David's shirt. He claimed he stained it while trying to resuscitate the children, but forensic experts began examining the location of the stains to see if it matched his story. The absence of other suspects. Investigators found no signs of an outside presence in the house or garage, making a version of an outside attack unlikely. David's behavior. His restraint and consistency in his story seemed suspicious to investigators. They expected to see more emotion, more confusion in his testimony, but David spoke confidently and clearly, which only increased their suspicions. After the interview was over, the police began checking David's alibi. They contacted his friends and others at the basketball game to confirm that he was indeed there at the time in question. They also began analyzing bloodstains on his clothing to determine if it could have gotten there as a result of assisting, as David claimed, or during the attack. The interview left investigators with a twofold impression. On the one hand, David seemed sincere and cooperative. On the other, the lack of obvious evidence against the other suspects made him the central figure in the investigation. His calmness and consistency could have been either the result of innocence or an attempt to hide the truth. As the investigation continued, David remained under the scrutiny of the police and the public. His every move, every word was scrutinized, as the answers to who killed Kimberly, Braden, and Jill could be closer than first thought. For days after the tragedy, police continued to work on the investigation into the murder of the Camm family. Investigators focused on details that could shed light on the identity of the killer. Evidence collected at the crime scene began to line up into a picture that police believed pointed to David Camm's involvement. One of the key pieces of evidence that police focused on was the small bloodstains found on David's shirt. At first glance, their location and size did not seem particularly suspicious. David attributed their presence to the fact that he was trying to resuscitate his children by cradling them against him and trying to stop the bleeding. However, forensic experts noticed that the shape of the stains were consistent with blood spatter from gunshots. The blood spatter expert concluded that such stains could only have gotten on the shirt in the immediate vicinity of the gunshots. This assumption was an important step for the investigation, because it cast doubt on David's version of events that he was not involved in the murder. In the eyes of the police, this made him not only a witness, but also a possible perpetrator of the crime. Additional suspicion was aroused by the testimony of several neighbors. Some of them later stated that they had seen David near the house at the alleged time of the murder. This testimony began to contradict the alibi that David had provided. He claimed he was at a basketball game, but neighbors described his actions that they believed did not match his story. One neighbor reported seeing David coming out of the garage around the time the murders were later determined to have occurred. Another neighbor stated that he heard sounds resembling gunshots and saw someone getting into a car near the house that looked like David's car. This testimony increased police confidence that David's alibi might be a fabrication. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the police found no signs indicating that outsiders were involved in the murder. The doors and windows of the house had not been broken into, and there were no signs of a struggle. The house looked as if the occupants had let the attacker in, which could indicate that they knew the man. That said, the Camm family's financial and personal records contained no conflicts that could have led to such a tragedy. The lack of obvious suspects other than David caused the investigation to focus on him. Investigators tried to envision his possible motives. Financial hardship, the stress of a career change, possible conflicts within the family were all seen as potential reasons for such a horrific crime. Police became increasingly convinced that David may have been involved. Based on the evidence and testimony gathered, as well as the lack of alternative suspects, David Cam was formally arrested on October 1, 2000, on suspicion of murdering his wife Kimberly and their 2 children, Braden and Jill. The decision to arrest was a turning point in the investigation, causing waves of controversy and outrage in the community. David vehemently denied his involvement, claiming that under no circumstances could he have harmed his family. His lawyer immediately filed an application for his release, arguing that the police evidence was circumstantial and did not prove his guilt. However, the court decided to keep him in custody until further investigations are completed. David's arrest divided the local community into 2 camps. Some believed he was guilty, pointing to the evidence presented by the police, while others were convinced he was the victim of a mistaken accusation. Relatives and friends of the Camm family also expressed conflicting opinions. Some of them declared their support for David, arguing that he could never have harmed his family. Others, on the contrary, expressed doubts about his honesty. Journalists and the media covered the case extensively, fueling public interest. David's arrest became a major news story, and his fate became the subject of much discussion. The public awaited answers to the main question: was he really guilty of murdering his family? Or was it a tragic miscarriage of justice? David Camm's arrest was the beginning of a long and convoluted trial that would answer the questions that preoccupied everyone who followed the case. After David Camm was arrested and a preliminary investigation was conducted, the first trial began that captured the attention of all of Indiana. The prosecution alleged that David committed the murder of his wife Kimberly and 2 children, Braden and Jill. The trial began in 2002 and was the first phase of a long courtroom drama that spanned more than a decade. The prosecution built its case on the following key pieces of evidence. Bloodstains on David's shirt. Experts stated that the small bloodstains on Camm's shirt were consistent with gunshot spatter. This indicated that David was in close proximity to the victims at the time they were killed. Witness testimony. Some neighbors claimed to have seen David in the vicinity of the house at the alleged time of the murders. These statements called into question his alibi about being at the basketball game. Absence of other suspects. No signs of forced entry or burglary were found in the house, and all evidence indicated that the victims knew the killer. The prosecution argued that David was the one who had the ability and access to the house. Motive. Although David had no direct motive, the prosecution suggested that the murder may have been related to an emotional crisis or an underlying conflict in the family. David Camm's attorneys challenged the evidence presented by the prosecution. The main line of defense was his lack of involvement in the murder and his solid alibi. The defense emphasized the following aspects. Alibi. David was at the basketball game at the time of the murder, as his friends could attest. They stated that they saw him on the court, and David himself described the events of that evening in detail. Lack of evidence. Defense lawyers argued that the blood on David's shirt could have gotten there as a result of his attempts to save the victims. They criticized the prosecution's experts for drawing 2 categorical conclusions based on interpretation of the evidence. Lack of motive. The defense emphasized that David had no reason to kill his family, with whom he lived in love and harmony. The trial lasted several months, with each side trying to convince the jury that they were right. Prosecutors built a chronology of events, trying to show that David had the opportunity to commit the crime and cover his tracks. They emphasized David's emotional state at the time of the emergency call, arguing that his reaction may have been feigned. The defense, in turn, questioned the reliability of expert and witness testimony. They argued that much of the testimony was inaccurate and based on conjecture. Also, the defense attorneys pointed out that there was no hard evidence that definitively linked David to the crime scene at the time of the murder. In 2002, the jury reached a guilty verdict. David Camm was found guilty of murdering his wife and children. The court sentenced him to 195 years in prison without parole. The verdict came as a shock to those who supported David, including his lawyers and some family members. David's arrest and conviction divided public opinion. Some believed that justice had been served and the perpetrator punished, while others believed that he had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. The case attracted the attention of journalists and analysts who discussed the shortcomings of the evidence presented and possible mistakes of the investigation. Despite the guilty verdict, the defense did not stop. David's attorneys appealed, arguing that mistakes had been made during the trial. In 2004, the Indiana Supreme Court agreed with their arguments, overturning the verdict because of inadmissible testimony that could have influenced the jury's decision. The first trial was the beginning of David Cam's long struggle to prove his innocence. After the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the first conviction in 2004, preparations for the second trial began. This trial was a new attempt by prosecutors to prove David Cam's guilt, but the case gained even more attention because of emerging questions about the quality of the investigation and the objectivity of the prosecution. David's attorneys vigorously challenged the evidence presented by the prosecution. The unreliability of Bonnie's testimony. The defense emphasized that Bonnie was a criminal personality, his testimony was unreliable and could have been made in exchange for leniency. Criticism of the forensics. The defense again questioned the accuracy of the bloodstain analysis, pointing to disagreements among experts. Alibi. David's attorneys provided additional evidence of his being at the basketball game at the alleged time of the murder, corroborated by new witnesses. In 2006, despite defense efforts, a jury again found David Cam guilty of murdering his wife and children. He was again sentenced to 195 years in prison. In 2009, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned the second conviction, citing procedural errors. The court ruled that some evidence and testimony should not have been presented to the jury, which could have influenced their decision. The third trial was the culmination of this complex case. It began in 2013 and was accompanied by increased public and media attention. This trial was to finally decide whether David Cam was guilty of murdering his family. At this point, the defense was able to significantly strengthen its case. Evidence against Charles Bonnie. The defense attorneys presented evidence that indicated that Bonnie may have acted alone. His footprints and DNA were found at the crime scene, making him the prime suspect. David's alibi. The defense strengthened their line by presenting additional witness testimony confirming that David was at the basketball game. Criticism of previous forensics. New experts questioned the interpretation of the bloodstains, stating that they could have gotten on David's clothes by accident. In October 2013, the jury, after considering all the evidence presented, reached a verdict of acquittal. David Cam was completely acquitted of all charges and released after 13 years in prison. However, the acquittal did not give David Cam his life back. He lost his wife, his children, his reputation, and his years behind bars. His story was an example of how devastating the combination of hasty conclusions of the investigation, the pressures of public opinion, and flaws in the judicial process can be. The community that watched the case learned an important lesson. Justice must be objective and based solely on facts, not emotions and assumptions. David Cam's story remains a reminder that every mistake in the judicial system is a ruined life that can never be recovered. For David Cam, it was not just a trial, but a journey to prove his innocence. His acquittal was a rare but important example that the fight for truth can succeed, even if it requires a long and painful journey.